This is Mental Health Through Will Training by Abraham A. Lowe. This is Section 1, Part 3, Temper, Sovereignty, and Fellowship. Panel discussion conducted by patients. Annette, panel leader. The subject for today's panel is taken from the article entitled Temper as Craving for Symbolic Victories. Has anyone an example? Frank R. I can give an example that shows two sides of the story. That is, the difference in the results whether temper is or is not controlled. The other night I walked home with Harriet and met my mother on the street. She had a letter to mail. I offered to let Harriet mail it so I could carry the bundles. But Mother asked me to mail it. As usual, she had to have her own way. I lost my temper and grabbed Harriet and said, "Let's go," leaving my mother to mail the letter. After that, I was pretty angry for a short while, but it was all over soon. In former years, I would have tried to justify myself. I would have been furious about the domineering ways of my mother, but this time I didn't do anything of the kind. The incident was closed as far as I was concerned. Later on, when Mother came home, I spoke to her and she did not answer. A year ago or so, I would have gotten angry again, but that evening I simply kept quiet. At supper, Mother hardly ate anything, and after the meal was over, she cried. Of course, I didn't like that, but since, as you all know, there is a deadlock between us, I couldn't do anything about it. As I said before, there is a difference in results between now and before. Before I had my recovery training, the deadlock led to endless quarrels because neither of us would give in. Now I keep quiet, and while the deadlock persists, there is no argument. More than that, in former days, I would have been angry and stayed angry for a long time, and incidentally, I wouldn't have felt like eating either, but on this particular night, I ate as usual. Annette. In other words, both of you and your mother would have staged a contest to see who would starve most and say least. Well, you say that this time you faced the fact that the manner in which you acted might have been wrong and temperamental. You refused to prove that you were right. That is, of course, the best way for cutting short arguments. Tilly. I was in the subway last Saturday and sat down close to the corner, and after I was seated, a woman entered the coach and wanted to squeeze in right between me and the corner. She persisted and made me move. I was provoked, but I moved although there was plenty of room in the coach. I felt my temper going up, and I would have liked to tell the person a thing or two. But then I began to get tense, and I knew that I had to stop working myself up. So I thought, after all, this is a public conveyance, and anybody can sit where he wants to. So when I thought of that, my tenseness left, and I stopped working myself up. Annette, what was it that made you stop your temperamental reaction? Tilly, I noticed the tightness in my side. When I get that way, I feel choked up. Then I can't stay in a closed room. That Saturday in the subway, if the tightness and choked feeling had kept up a few more minutes, I would have wanted to get off the train. So I stopped working myself up and the sensation left. Sophie, before I had my recovery training, when I called my children from outside to come and eat, they usually didn't respond to my first or second call. Then I would get this tightening in my throat or a pressure in my head, and my temper would rise and the symptoms would get more severe. After I got into recovery, I learned that I had to control my temper in order to check this irritation. Now I call the children a half dozen times, and I can call on the same level of voice, and my temper doesn't rise anymore. In the past, when I used to work myself up, I always feared that something would burst in my head for sure. Annette, I will quote an example of my own. An elderly aunt of mine, we shall call her Aunt Jane, was the type of person who enjoyed temper tangles. She had never lived with anyone, but during the Depression we had to take her into our home. When she came, I decided I'd make an effort to get along with her. I felt I could do that because she confessed to be fond of me. But what I actually did was to try to convince her that she was wrong, and that, of course, ended up in a pretty terrific temperamental outburst on both of our sides. One time, after a rather heated argument, I awoke in the middle of the night with a very odd sensation in my abdomen. I felt as though something awful had happened and I was going to burst. I was frightened, but did not know at the time that these were nervous symptoms. The sensation followed so regularly on temperamental spats, I couldn't help realizing that they were closely associated with my temper. Several years after I had undergone a good deal of recovery training, I had occasion to get in contact with Aunt Jane again. A friend of mine let me use her car, and I invited Aunt Jane to join us on an automobile ride. This time I had a good opportunity to notice how I had changed while my aunt had not. Whenever I found myself wanting to prove her wrong and myself right, I knew at that very moment that all I was out to accomplish was a symbolic victory. I stopped short instantly, and instead of getting provoked myself or getting her worked up, I merely answered her remarks with maybe or is that so? The argument didn't even get started. On leaving the car, my aunt was obviously irritated and said, I am just worn out. I never spent such a boring day in my life. And if that remark didn't provoke me into a sharper answer, I realized that I must have learned the technique of giving up the battling for trivial symbolic victories. Carol, about this temper, I think it is grand that we have been drilled to get rid of it. In my case, it is when I am with Pete, my husband, and I start to blow off steam. Pete, who knows recovery, then says, Temper, and that puts me on the right track again. A year ago or so, I would have been provoked with him when he would say temper, and I would snap back, What of it if I have a temper? After that, I would usually let off a honey of a temper. But now I know he helps me check it. And when I feel my temper rising, I cut the feeling down, and it doesn't have a chance at all. Annette, in conclusion, I would like to say that the panel members meant to bring out that we all got into temperamental situations. In former days before we had our recovery training, we would have exploded or fretted with long drawn out after effect. During the explosion, we would have had the momentary satisfaction of letting off steam. That would give us a momentary sense of relief. Besides that, we would have had the pleasure of feeling ourselves in the right and the other person in the wrong. It is these two pleasures, letting off steam and feeling in the right, that our physician calls the dual premium placed on temper. The trouble is that this dual premium is short-lived, lasting only a few moments, but then it is followed by the after effect, which may last hours or even days. In that period of the after effect, we suffered many distressing symptoms. I know that I, for one, learned that the few moments of pleasure enjoyed during the immediate effects are not worth the hours and days of suffering I endured during the after effect. Temper, sovereignty, and fellowship. Physicians' comments on the panel discussion. A letter was to be mailed, and, as a result, an ugly street scene developed, and my family group took their evening meal in the dead silence of a sullen mood. Tears were shed and feelings were crushed, and all the commotion, confusion, and agony were caused by a letter to be mailed. But a letter is a sheet of paper, and as such utterly incapable of rousing tempers and offending feelings. No issue was involved. The contents of the letter were not challenged. The propriety, wisdom, and advisability of it being mailed were not in question. It was simply a fight about nothing, a struggle for a scrap of paper, a fight without an issue, a fight for the sake of fighting. How is it that men and women of mature age engage in fighting for nothing? Obviously, mature years do not necessarily mean mature thinking or adult acting. A fight is centered around an object and rooted in a motive. In the case of Frank and his mother, the object was the letter. What was the motive? The motive is a force that makes muscles move. Suppose the letter which the lady wanted to mail was addressed to a friend. Then the thought of the friend, the desire to communicate with her, the intention to please her supplied the motive that made Frank's mother walk into the street and move towards the mailbox. If Frank and his wife Harriet had not entered the scene, the letter would have been mailed without ado, and we would have no difficulty understanding the object of the walk, its motive, and its successful execution. We would say that an act of behavior was manipulated correctly, or that its purpose aimed correctly at its proper goal. After Frank and Harriet made their appearance, the muscles of the letter-carrying lady suddenly deviated from the goal of the mailbox. The purpose of mailing was forgotten and neglected, and aiming was directed towards something that had essentially nothing to do with the original purpose. The new purpose intervened, changed the goal, and redirected the aiming. The original purpose was to communicate with another person, to give pleasure, to show consideration. The motive here was service, and service serves an end of peace. It creates goodwill and promotes the welfare of the group. This motive of service and group welfare was suddenly shelved after the arrival of Frank. A fight ensued, and its motive was hostility, competition, domination. What prompted that change in attitude? What is it that makes a person abruptly shift from a disposition to serve to a disposition to dominate? Whenever you are alone in the privacy of your own home, you are the master of your dispositions. You may do as you please, and you may release whatever disposition you wish to express, provided you keep within the bounds of law, moral, and ethics. If you present disposition, if your present disposition is to undress, you may disrobe at will. If you wish to rest, you may lay down on the couch. If you desire to sing, to whistle, to eat, to read, to keep the eyes open or closed, there is nobody to check you, no standard to impose restrictions on your whim or caprice. Under conditions of privacy, you are in unquestioned control of your decisions and enjoy the exclusive and uncontested right to act as you choose. Being the master of your destiny and the law unto yourself, you are sovereign. That sovereignty of yours is severely curtailed the moment you step out into the street. Now you are subject to rules which restrict your rights and put a check to your dispositions. You cannot, for instance, place a couch in the middle of the street and take your afternoon rest there. Even should the street be empty, you would not be permitted to use it as your private dwelling place. Outside your home, your conduct is required to conform to regulations, customs, and traditions, even if no legal, moral, or ethical issues are involved. The reason is that out in the street you may meet other people, and once you are among people, you are the member of the group. And in a group, you are rule bound and lose your sovereignty, at least part of it. In a group, the members are fellows with equal rights, demanding that their rights be respected by the fellow members. This is called fellowship and is opposed to sovereignty. Fellowship means service, self restraint, and respect for the rights of others. Sovereignty means you may mean the reverse: domination, unrestricted power, and disregard for the needs, desires, and rights of others. Fellowship is the principle of group action, sovereignty that of individualism. To the extent that a sovereign recognizes other persons as his fellows, he loses his prerogative of sovereignty. To the extent that a group of fellows grants to any of its members the status of sovereignty, it weakens the principle of fellowship. Groups are either loose assemblages, for instance, a crowd in a street, or a close-knit organization like a family. The closer a group is organized, the more it is pervaded by the spirit of fellowship. There is hardly a trace of fellowship in the street crowd. There should be a maximum of it in the family. All kinds of groups could be ranged between the street crowd and the family, with varying degrees of fellowship governing their mutual relations. On this scale, a group of friends ought to be held together by a far greater measure of fellowship than, like me say, a group of co-workers in a shop, and the group of co-workers should score a higher rating in fellowship than a group of voters attending a political meeting. The point that I wish to make is that the family ought to rank highest in point of fellowship among all closely organized groups. In a family, fellowship ought to be at its maximum, sovereignty at its lowest possible minimum. That this is not so is clearly evidenced by almost universal prevalence of domestic temper. Excuse me. When Frank met his mother, he offered to mail a letter. Behind this offer was a desire or determination to be helpful, or courteous, or considerate. The act expressed the motive of service, that is, a spirit of fellowship. Frank has frequently stated in panel discussions that he and his mother do not get along well together. They live in a more or less continuous temperamental deadlock, in an atmosphere of strife, spite, and bitterness. You may conclude, therefore, that Frank's offer was a polite gesture rather than a genuine eagerness to be of help. But in a group life, an insincere gesture of generosity and fellowship is far more valuable than an outspoken expression of enmity and a brutal assertion of one's sovereignty. No doubt the rebuff offered by Frank's mother was sincere. It was based on sincere bitterness and sincere hostility. Sincerity of this kind is anything but an asset. A group is interested in peace and order, and peace and order are destroyed or disrupted by the temperamental expressions of anger, vindictiveness, and bitterness. A temperamental outburst is sincere, of course. So are murder and burglary. They are based on genuine and sincere desires to kill and rob. That the mother was sincere in her rude reaction to Frank's offer of fellowship was no credit to her. The reaction was dictated by a mother's will to have her own way, but by her insistence on domination and her determination to assert her sovereign rights. As such, it served the ends of unrestricted individualism, not those of rule-bound group life. It was based on a principle of sovereignty, not fellowship. This is not an attempt to exonerate our friend Frank. He practiced his share of rudeness and sovereignty when in a temperamental act of brusqueness, he grabbed Harriet and said, "Let's go." Both mother and son are currently disposed to display excess of domestic temper, exercising their disposition to assert their sovereign rights, and ignoring the needs for fellowship, mutuality, and toleration. What interests us here is the close relation that exists between workings of an aggressive temper on one hand and the spirit of sovereignty and fellowship on the other. The members of the panel spoke of symbols and symbolic victories. One of the most pernicious symbols of that excuse me symbols is that of sovereignty. Frank's mother imagined, perhaps unknown to herself, that she represented or symbolized sovereignty in her dealings with the members of her family. Her will to assert her sovereignty provoked the resistance of her son, with the result that family life was turned into a battlefield of temperamental dispositions, in which both mother and son craved the glory of symbolic victories, and both effectively frustrated one another's ludicrous ambitions. In the end, a cruel, implacable deadlock developed in which feelings and sensibilities were ruthlessly slaughtered and fellowship was made a shambles. The realistic objects of the incessant fights were invariably such trivialities as a letter to be mailed and a sugar bowl to be filled. The symbolic goal was the craving to assert sovereign rights. The inevitable results were tears, crushed feelings, and the refusal to eat or otherwise to share and to practice fellowship. The deadlock between Frank and his mother is undoubtedly extreme. It is characterized by an extreme insistence on the exercise of unrestricted sovereignty and an equally extreme refusal to practice fellowship. Deadlocks of more moderate intensity were mentioned by the other members of the panel. Annette was in a deadlock with her sour dispositioned aunt, Sophie with her boisterous youngsters, Carol with her soft spoken and well intentioned husband. All of them were in one way or another embroiled in a tug of war of domestic temper, All of them had in previous years indulged in the cruel game of craving symbolic victories in the battle for their sovereign rights, and all of them had an unenvious record of tears shed, feelings crushed, and meals taken in dead silence of sullen moods. But all of them told you in unmistakable language that for them the concept of sovereignty had been finally exposed as an empty, silly, and childish symbol, and fellowship has become a living, mature, and concrete reality. Even Frank, the helpless party to the relentless and apparently incurable deadlock, was able to state that before he had his recovery training, the deadlock led to endless quarrels because neither of us would give in. Now I keep quiet, and while the deadlock persists, there is no argument. In his home, fellowship is not reestablished, but the peace destroying symbolism of sovereignty has been routed, and with it Frank's symptoms of fatigue and sleeplessness. And it is that recovery training is capable of laying the ghost of sovereignty, then we may be pardoned for claiming that our system of self-help is the sovereign means for promoting fellowship. Thank you. Please come back for the next section as soon as I can get to it. Bye bye.